All right, it is the return of one of our great favorites. Katie Halper is here to talk about all of the ways in which the media covers themselves in glory. She is, of course, host of The Katie Halper Show and co-host of the Useful Idiots podcast, which you can find now free and independent, not like monetarily free, but free from constraints and independent. Over on Substack. Great to see you, Katie.
Good to see you, Katie.
You guys too. A lot of it is free. Over half of it is free. And then you can, of course, get extra content. Yeah.
Boom. We'll have a link in the show notes there as well as in the YouTube description. It's good to see you.
Great,
and
thank you.
We have a good topic that we have around Mike Gravel, the death of that great United States Senator. And our producer, James, helped put these together, which is that the obituary around Mike Gravel, as opposed to some other people, has been pretty interesting. So here's one. Mike Gravel, gadfly senator from Alaska with a flair for the theatrical, dies at 91. And in the headlines for a lot of these things, Katie, they focused on the words gadfly, they focused on flair for the theatrical. I know that you have a couple of quotes that you found as well. And the Pentagon Papers, which are frankly his real legacy, were downplayed in a lot of these obituaries.
Yeah, I mean, it's really disgusting. Not only were they downplayed, but they were expressed as some kind of opportunistic attention-getting thing, as opposed to an incredibly brave, unique moment where he was the only person in only elected official willing to talk about them. I mean, I'm really surprised because I know that at the time that was controversial, but nowadays people pretend that they're happy that they were read out loud and entered into the congressional record, and it's considered a patriotic thing to do, both on his part and Daniel Ellsberg's part. And they, of course, work together. Daniel Ellsberg is the whistleblower who's responsible for getting the Pentagon Papers out there. He was a defense analyst. But it's not just the headline that's so offensive and dismissive. But if you actually read the body of the obit, first of all, shout out to the New York Times for kind of wearing it on their sleeve. It was written by someone who died in 2018. So that's how much respect they have for the late great senator, is that they don't even pretend. You know, why don't you just pretend plagiarize the dead guy who wrote the obit and pretend it was written recently? So shout out to them, honestly, for that honesty. Okay. But they actually said they referred to his reading the Pentagon Papers as attention getting and grandstanding. Can you imagine this? Attention getting and grandstanding. That's in the actual article in the body of the piece. They call him an unabashed attention getter. In one case, reading the Pentagon Papers out loud at a hearing at a time when newspapers were barred from publishing them, and later mounting a long shot presidential runs. He nonetheless persisted, showing the same commitment to going it alone that he had displayed by nominating himself for vice president in 1972, staging one-man filibusters and reading the Pentagon Papers aloud, efforts that even senators who agreed with him regarded as grandstanding. I mean, the gall to choose to highlight that. You could have said it so many different ways, right? He made history. He was a free press trailblazer. How about the fact that he was incredibly brave in calling out the militarism and imperialism of the people running for president in 2008? It's an amazing moment in history where he just says that they frightened him. He called all of them out, all the top tier candidates at that point in the 2008 primary. It's really disrespectful and disgusting. You have also the Washington Post saying Mike Gravel, gadfly senator from Alaska with flair for the theatrical, dies at 91. I mean, and you compare that to the death of Rumsfeld, right? And the way that
we have a side by side.
Let me pull that up. Yeah. So two notable deaths this week. One of a great American hero, Mike Gravel, who's dismissed as a gadfly, in the same way, frankly, that Bernie Sanders was for much of his career until he almost became president. And then you have Donald Rumsfeld, who the very same outlet that described Mike Gravel as a gadfly says Rumsfeld had the distinction of being the only defense chief to serve two non-consecutive terms, 1975 to 77 under Ford, 2001 to 2006 under George W. Bush. He also was the youngest at 43 and the oldest to hold that post. Wow.
Sounds true.
Sounds like an incredible trailblazer. Katie, this is an incredible man that we should all be celebrating and very sad and regretful, mournful about his death.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, he does have a lot. He did achieve a lot in terms of how much blood he has on his hands, something that Mike Gravel could never have achieved, because, of course, he called out the Iraq War that Rumsfeld helped orchestrate. And if you look at the actual headlines and subheadlines, what you have is you have Mike Gravel, unconventional two-term Alaska senator, this is the New York Times, dies at 91. He made headlines by fighting for an oil pipeline and reading the Pentagon Papers aloud. After 25 years of obscurity, he reemerged with a quixotic presidential campaign. And by the way, it wasn't quixotic because he knew he wasn't going to win. He did that to push issues, right? I mean, that's what Sanders did at the beginning. He didn't think he had any chance. So even framing it as a quixotic presidential campaign is, of course, distorting what he did. Although, what are we expecting from this total? I mean, whatever. I'm just going to call it trash by now, the New York Times. Mm-hmm. And then you have Donald Rumsfeld, the headline, Defense Secretary during Iraq War is dead at 88. Mr. Rumsfeld, who served 4 presidents, oversaw a war that many said should never have been fought. But he said the removal of Saddam Hussein had, quote, created a more stable and secure world, end quote. So they quote him within the sub-headline, right? Mm-hmm. So they're choosing to highlight to center his narrative, right? They don't do that with Mike Gravel. They never do that in his obituary. And again, this is a guy who actually did good for the world as opposed to Rumsfeld, who helped destroy the world. And they're quoting him. So they're like immediately just in the sub-headline, they're allying themselves with him, right? They're like sharing his worldview. They're letting him define his own legacy. And in the body of the obit, the Rumsfeld obit, it's interesting because they say, more than 4 years out of office, he still expressed no regrets over the decision to invade Iraq, which had cost the United States $700 billion and 4,400 American lives, insisting that the removal of President Hussein had justified the effort. Now, what's interesting there is they don't even pretend to care about the Iraqis killed. They don't even name the number. Mm-hmm. Also, there are more than those American lives if you count the things that happened in terms of suicide and right, like, and that's an underestimation, but.
That's just deaths. We're not even talking about wounded. I mean,
right, wounded, yes, and people people don't understand when you talk about casualties. These are people coming home without limbs. These are people coming home who without like the amazing medical technology just would have been dead. And so it's just really offensive, and I feel really bad for Mike Gravel's family. I mean, what they have as solace is the fact that people with a moral compass are coming out and praising him. I interviewed him on my show, and he was in November. He was great. He was totally alert. He was with it. He had way more insight than, any of the elected politicians now, except for maybe Bernie Sanders, of course. And they have the same contempt for Sanders as they do for Gravel. You see the distortion, the contempt, the hatred. And I also had Lynn Mosier, who's his daughter, Mike Gravel's daughter. And she wrote a wonderful obit for him. And I had Dan Ellsberg on, again, a hero who was praising him. So at least you have the good people doing it. I think the New York Times and the Washington Post, which was also dismissive, really owe not just Mike Gravel and his family an apology, but the world an apology. I mean, it's such irresponsible journalism, especially when you compare it with the way that they are just praising Rumsfeld.
Yeah. And I know it's a tricky thing when someone dies who was a bad person and, perpetuated evil. Like, people get uncomfortable about telling the truth. But I'm not a person who believes, especially when it's a public figure, that you should allow the evil deeds of that person's lifetime to be sort of like spun and erased and covered up in death. Again, especially if you're a public person. It's different if you're a private person. It's different if you're talking about family members, et cetera. But it's really important for historical context that the final impression of these individuals is accurate. Accurate. That's it. I also think, with Gravel, it's so much larger than him, because this is the type of psyop that they do. Anytime you have someone who bucks the mainstream, who's actually on the right side of history, who has the moral high ground, but it's easy, they just dismiss them as like a weirdo, right? A fringe, a gadfly, a lunatic, and then people get the impression, oh, this was like a weirdo, this wasn't, rather than a person who actually had total moral clarity in that moment and did something that was incredibly courageous and vitally important at a time when, the Nixon administration was fighting tooth and nail from keeping the Pentagon Papers from being released. This case went to the Supreme Court. They're trying to block the New York Times from publishing any of this. And for people who, weren't alive, I wasn't alive, we weren't alive, but who haven't followed the history closely, like, this was one of the most significant insights into the way that our government, the unconscionable way, frankly, but also evilly bureaucratic way in which this war was propagated, which reverberates throughout the years and provided an invaluable insight into the way that our government actually wields power and casually wields power with regards to lethal force. So
exactly. And
rest in power, Mike Gravel.
Yes, rest in power. And one final thing is that you pointed out, you don't think that people should legacy and history should be whitewashed, and I agree. But beyond that, it's that these outlets, the New York Times, chooses to whitewash one person and to smear another, right? So they're not even consistent. They don't even have. It's not even a question of decorum, and don't speak ill of the dead.
Very true.
And they also, final thing, they called him a quirky fixture. In several early debates, calling for a constitutional amendment to allow citizens to enact laws by referendums. Again, totally judgmental, pretending to be just calling balls and strikes and talking about it, but calling that a quirky idea. Wow, direct democracy, isn't that insane and quirky? From this grandstanding, attention-getting,
That's a really good point around who gets editorialized and who doesn't. Katie, really appreciate you joining us. It was great to see you again.
Great to have you on, Katie.
Oh, and he was one of the sexiest people, Rumsfeld.
True.
Well, none of us can deny him that legacy, Katie. So thank you for bringing that to the table. All right, Katie, we'll see you soon.
See you later. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for watching, guys. We'll have more for you later.